The gleaming aluminum fuselage caught the harsh Atlantic wind that October morning in 1942. 10 young Americans stood beneath the massive wings of their Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress at Bangor, Maine. The cold bit through their leather jackets as they examined serial number 41-24485. None of these men realized they were about to etch their names into aviation history. Not through manufactured Hollywood drama, but through raw survival against mathematical impossibility. Captain Robert K. Morgan from Asheville, North Carolina, traced his fingers along the aircraft's riveted skin. This particular bomber had rolled off the production line on July 15, 1942. The 91st Bombardment Group received delivery in September. The lanky pilot had no idea his crew would become the most famous bomber team in American military history. Their B-17 would carry them across the Atlantic to England. The 324th Bombardment Squadron of the 91st Bombardment Group waited at RAF Bassingbourn. But Morgan had made his crew a promise first. They would make one special stop. The detour took them south to Tennessee. Memphis welcomed the crew with Southern hospitality. There, Morgan christened his bomber after Margaret Polk, his sweetheart, back home. He had originally planned to call the aircraft Little One. That was his private nickname for her, but a recent film had featured a riverboat called Memphis Belle. The name felt perfect. Young Margaret Polk became an icon without knowing it. Her image would soon grace the nose of a bomber heading into the most dangerous skies in military history. September 30, 1942, brought deployment to Prestwick, Scotland. October 1st saw a temporary move to RAF Kimballton. Their permanent home at RAF Bassingbourn, England came on October 14th. The base sat in peaceful Cambridgeshire countryside, just north of London. For the next 7 months, this would be home. What awaited them would test human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The statistics were absolutely terrifying. American bomber losses over Europe reached 82% in those early months. Morgan would later describe the horror in simple terms during post-war interviews. 80% losses meant 10 men ate breakfast together. Only 2 remained for dinner. The War Department had established a combat tour requirement. Crews needed to complete a specific number of missions before rotation home. But in those dark days of late 1942 and early 1943, reaching that number seemed mathematically impossible. Of bomber crews attempting the original 25-mission tour during 1942 to 1943, just 35% survived to completion. November 7, 1942, marked their combat debut. The Memphis Belle lifted off from Bassingbourn in pre-dawn darkness. Their target, German submarine pens at Brest, France. The crew had trained extensively for months. Nothing could have prepared them for what lay ahead. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing doctrine. This strategy developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in Maxwell Field, Alabama. The Air Force entered World War II believing unescorted daylight bombing could work. They possessed no long-range escort fighters in their planning. British commanders predicted catastrophic losses during daylight raids. Their predictions proved horrifyingly accurate. American P-47 Thunderbolts and Royal Air Force Spitfires provided limited escort range. These fighters reached maximum operational distance near Germany's western border. Then, they turned back toward base. American bombers faced German Luftwaffe attacks alone from that point forward. 2 days after their inaugural mission, November 9th brought another strike to Saint-Nazaire. November 17th sent them back again. The American bomb groups tackled heavily defended targets throughout occupied Europe. Submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire and Brest represented priority objectives. Docks and shipbuilding facilities at Wilhelmshaven drew constant attention. Railroad yards in the Ruhr Valley endured repeated attacks. Aircraft factories at Antwerp faced regular bombardment. German submarine pens proved nearly indestructible. Massive concrete structures protected U-boats from bombing damage. Yet the 8th Air Force continued sending formations against them, mission after mission. December brought bitter winter weather and continued operations. December 6th targeted locomotive works at Lille, France. December 20th struck the airfield at Romilly-sur-Seine. Each mission represented a roll of deadly dice. Each return to Bassingbourn meant counting empty hard stands where bombers had departed that morning but would never return. The Memphis Belle absorbed tremendous punishment during these early missions. 5 separate occasions saw engines shot completely out. Once she limped home with her tail section nearly severed. Bullet holes and flak damage covered her fuselage after every mission. Yet remarkably, not one crew member suffered major injury. This fact alone defied statistical probability. 1943 opened with no relief from combat operations. January 3rd brought them back over Saint-Nazaire. January 13th returned them to Lille. January 23rd targeted submarine pens at Lorient. Over the flak-filled skies of Lorient, on January 23, 1943, Memphis Belle fought for survival. German fighters penetrated their protective screen first. Then, dense anti-aircraft fire surrounded them. The bomber held steady course with no evasive maneuvers during the bomb run. Accuracy demanded this terrible discipline. Late January 1943 brought Hollywood to Bassingbourn. Major William Wyler had created acclaimed films like Wuthering Heights and Mrs. Miniver. Now he served with the U.S. Army Air Force, making documentaries about the European War. Morgan states in his memoirs that Wyler approached him after their 8th mission in late January 1943. Wyler explained his interest in filming the Memphis Belle and her crew. The aircraft's mystique and Morgan's reputation as a skilled pilot meant action footage with reasonable survival chances. Originally, Wyler had been following Captain Oscar O'Neill and his bomber invasion 2nd of the 414th Bombing Squadron. April 17, 1943, sealed O'Neill's fate. His B-17 and 5 others from the 401st were shot down over Bremen, Germany. This mission represented the costliest single day yet for the 8th Air Force. Wyler needed a new subject. Morgan and the Memphis Belle became his focus. February 4th brought their 9th mission to Emden, Germany. This marked their first strike into Germany proper. February 14th saw them over Hamm, Germany. February 16th brought severe battle damage over Saint-Nazaire again. The Memphis Belle required extensive repairs after the February 16th mission damage. While ground crews labored to restore their bomber, Wyler filmed his first mission aboard a different aircraft. February 26, 1943, saw him fly with the B-17 Jersey Bounce to Wilhelmshaven, Germany, while Memphis Belle underwent repairs. That mission experienced heavy German fighter attacks. 2 B-17s from the 91st Group were shot down. Despite obvious hazards, Wyler continued filming combat missions with Morgan's crew. Not every mission flew aboard Memphis Belle due to maintenance requirements. Camera positions included nose, tail, right waist, and radio compartment locations. Documenting this war extracted a terrible price, measured in lives. First Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, a World War I veteran serving as one of 3 cinematographers, was killed in action during filming. His bomber was shot down over France on April 16, 1943. Wyler suffered severe frostbite and lost his hearing for months after bombing runs. The extreme conditions at 25,000 feet altitude took their toll on everyone. Back in combat, Memphis Belle crew continued accumulating missions toward their goal. March brought strikes to Lorient on the 6th. Rouen faced attacks on the 12th and 13th. Wilhelmshaven endured bombardment on the 22nd. They returned to Rouen on the 28th. April missions included Antwerp on the 5th and Lorient on the 16th. The costly Bremen raid occurred on April 17th. May brought them to Saint-Nazaire on the 1st and Antwerp on the 4th. By mid-May 1943, they approached the magical threshold. Several bombers raced to complete combat tours simultaneously. A B-17F nicknamed Delta Rebel No. 2 completed 25 credited combat missions on May 1, 1943. This achievement marked the first B-17 in the European theater to reach that milestone. Hell's Angels, a B-17F of the 303rd Bombardment Group, completed 25 combat missions on May 13, 1943. Neither aircraft would return to the United States for publicity tours, however. Memphis Belle crew reached that milestone without losing a single crewman to death. This remarkable record made her the logical candidate for the first war bond tour back home. Tragically, Delta Rebel No. 2 was shot down during the August 12, 1943 mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany. 6 crew members became prisoners of war. 4 were killed in action. May 15th brought their 24th mission to Wilhelmshaven. One more mission, just one more, and they would complete their tour. Wyler's film actually depicted this next-to-last mission on May 15, 1943. Wyler had informed Morgan about backup plans. Had Memphis Belle been shot down on the crew's final mission, he had another crew standing by. Hell's Angels of the nearby 303rd Bombardment Group was also approaching 25 missions. May 17, 1943 arrived. Memphis Belle flew her 25th and final combat mission. The target, the massive German submarine base at Lorient, France. She had flown 148 hours and 50 minutes of combat time. More than 20,000 combat miles lay behind them during those 25 missions. Memphis Belle gunners were credited with shooting down 8 enemy fighters. 5 additional probable kills were recorded. At least a dozen more enemy aircraft sustained damage from their defensive fire. The crew dropped more than 60 tons of bombs over France, Germany, and Belgium. They had accomplished the impossible. They had beaten mathematical odds that defied reason. Each crew member received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and 3 oak leaf clusters. Only tail gunner staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan received a Purple Heart for being officially wounded in combat. May 18th brought royal recognition. King George VI, wearing the uniform of a Marshal of the Royal Air Force, congratulated the crew. Queen Elizabeth stood beside him. 10 young Americans faced the King and Queen of England. These men had carried the war to Nazi Germany and lived to tell their story. June 8, 1943, saw Memphis Belle flown back to the United States by a composite crew. Captain Morgan led the flight home for a 31-city war bond tour. Morgan's original co-pilot, Captain James Varinas, had been promoted to aircraft commander of another B-17 named Connecticut Yankee. He piloted that bomber for his final 16 missions, completing his tour on May 13th. However, he rejoined Morgan's crew as co-pilot for the flight back to America. The crew that completed the tour represented America's diversity. Ages ranged from 19 to 26 years. They came from states spanning the continent: Washington, Indiana, Texas, and Connecticut. Captain Robert K. Morgan, pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, was 24 years old. Captain James Varinas hailed from Woodbridge, Connecticut. Captain Charles B. Layton served as navigator from Flint, Michigan. Captain Vincent B. Evans, bombardier, came from Fort Worth, Texas. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hansen operated the radio from Walla Walla, Washington. Technical Sergeant Harold P. Locke served as top turret gunner and engineer from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Staff Sergeant Cecil H. Scott manned the ball turret gun from Cherokee, North Carolina. Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan operated tail guns from Yonkers, New York. Staff Sergeant Casimir A. Nastel served as waist gunner from Detroit, Michigan. Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell, the other waist gunner, came from Oak Park, Illinois. Notably absent was Staff Sergeant Eugene Scott Miller, the right waist gunner from Kingwood, West Virginia. Miller had flown 15 missions aboard the Belle, but missed the tour because he hadn't completed 25 missions yet. While his crewmates were celebrated across America, Miller remained in England, continuing combat missions until he finished his own tour. His contributions would be overlooked for decades. Stuka accompanied them on the tour. This Scottish Terrier, purchased by co-pilot Jim Verinis in a London pet store, had participated in combat missions. In a war of such magnitude and horror, the presence of this small dog provided normalcy and comfort. The crew visited more than 32 cities where they received heroes' welcomes. Washington, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Wichita, and Mobile rolled out red carpets. Bond rallies occurred throughout the country, but Memphis Belle crew brought something different from Hollywood stars. These were men who had faced death repeatedly and returned home. In Captain Morgan's hometown of Asheville, the final night brought special celebration. City fathers held a party and reception at the City Hall auditorium. Each crew member spoke to the crowd. Morgan, in sentimental mood, reminisced about mountain moonshine and promised to fly it around the country after the war ended. The home folks loved every word. These young men, barely out of their teens, had become symbols of American courage and determination. At every stop, crowds gathered eagerly. People wanted to touch the aircraft itself. They examined bullet holes and flak damage carefully. Meeting the men who had flown her into combat meant everything to them. The tour served multiple purposes beyond raising war bonds. Combat crews in training could be guided toward combat efficiency. Production workers in factories could see their handiwork being used effectively. The American people could understand what the war was really about, but the tour also revealed tensions beneath the heroic narrative. The tour proved difficult for Jim Verinis. It marked the beginning of living in Bob Morgan's shadow, something that continued for the rest of his life. Press coverage eternally dubbed him as Memphis Belle's co-pilot, despite commanding Connecticut Yankee for 20 missions and beating Morgan to 25 missions completed. The narrative demanded a single hero. Morgan filled that role perfectly. The nuances and complexities of crew dynamics were sacrificed for storytelling simplicity. Morgan's relationship with Margaret Polk also became strained during the tour. Their breakup occurred during the latter stages of the publicity campaign. The young romance that inspired the aircraft's name could not withstand fame's pressures and the changes war had brought to both of them. After 3 months touring America, Memphis Belle's combat days ended forever. December 23, 1943, brought assignment to MacDill, Florida. There she became a B-17 aircrew and ground crew training aircraft, remaining until Victory in Europe Day. The aircraft that survived combat missions would now teach others how to survive their own missions. The bomber that had faced German flak and fighters spent the rest of the war preparing new crews for what awaited them over Europe. After VE Day, the aircraft flew to Altus Army Airfield, Oklahoma, for storage and eventual reclamation. Across vast American fields, thousands of aircraft sat awaiting the scrappers. Industrial might that had produced them now found no use for them. Memphis Belle seemed destined for the same fate as thousands of other warbirds, to be cut up and melted down. But Memphis Mayor Walter Chandler intervened. He arranged for the city of Memphis to purchase the B-17 for $350. This represented less than a single mission's fuel cost. The bomber flew to Memphis in July 1946 and remained in storage until mid-1949. Then the aircraft was placed on display at the National Guard Armory near the city's fairgrounds. It sat outdoors into the 1980s, slowly deteriorating from weather and vandalism. The famous bomber that had survived German fighters and flak was being destroyed by something far more insidious: neglect and time's passage. Paint peeled away. Aluminum corroded steadily. Vandals left their marks everywhere. Memphis Belle, sitting exposed to the elements in Memphis, was slowly dying. After relentless efforts by Frank D'Onofrio, a local businessman, the city agreed to donate Mud Island land where the historic bomber could be properly displayed. Federal Express and Boeing each donated $100,000 toward restoration efforts. The city contributed $150,000. When Hugh Downs of TV's 2020 aired the need for additional funding, the American people donated the remaining amount. The total restoration cost reached $576,000. May 17, 1987 marked Dedication Day. Exactly 44 years after she flew her 25th mission, Memphis Belle Pavilion opened with nearly 25,000 people in attendance. 7 B-17s, the largest formation since World War II, flew overhead in salute. They bombed the pavilion with thousands of rose petals. Margaret Polk and Belle crew members looked on as crowds cheered thunderously. It was a moment of triumph. The famous bomber finally received the care and respect it deserved. Margaret Polk, who had helped with fundraising efforts, died in 1990. But the outdoor display on Mud Island, while well-intentioned, could not provide the controlled environment necessary for long-term preservation. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force indicated they wanted the aircraft back for restoration and eventual display at Wright-Patterson AFB near Dayton, Ohio. Belle arrived at the museum in mid-October 2005 and was placed in one of their restoration hangars. She had been trucked in corroded pieces after Memphis restoration efforts ran out of money. What followed represented one of aviation history's most meticulous aircraft restorations. The project required 55,000 hours to restore the plane to wartime glory. 55,000 hours of careful, painstaking work by people who understood the significance of their task. More than 100 people, mostly volunteers, worked on the four-engine bomber. After stripping paint from the aircraft fuselage, hundreds of names and personal messages were discovered scratched into the aluminum skin. These scratches, left by visitors over decades, told their own story. People had wanted to leave their mark, to somehow connect themselves to this famous aircraft. Restoration specialist Casey Simmons noted that priority one was getting everything absolutely right. They fabricated even parts no visitor would ever see, like a glycol heater missing from inside the left wing. The restoration team committed to making the aircraft complete and authentic, even in areas never visible to the public. Many parts, long since out of production, forced restorers to manufacture new components by hand. Sometimes they worked with only fragments of old parts. Often they had no blueprints at all. These skilled craftsmen were not simply fixing an old airplane. They were preserving history itself, ensuring that future generations could see and understand exactly what the men of the 8th Air Force had flown into combat. March 14, 2018, brought Memphis Belle into the museum's World War II gallery during a private event. Official unveiling occurred 2 months later on May 17, 2018, the 75th anniversary of completing her 25th mission. Robert K. Morgan Jr.'s voice wavered with emotion when discussing seeing Memphis Belle completely restored for the first time in 50 years. His father had flown the legendary B-17F on 25 perilous bombing missions and worked the rest of his life ensuring the airplane would be preserved. Morgan Jr. explained that his father knew before passing that the plane would come to the museum. They couldn't keep it in Memphis any longer. He was extremely glad it would be preserved and restored properly there. William Wyler's documentary became part of Memphis Belle's enduring legacy. The 16mm color film originally contained no sound, which was added later in Hollywood studios. The original crew, during their war bond drive, made appropriate comments to each other while watching the silent movie in a studio. The result became difficult to distinguish from real combat recordings. Over 15 hours of film shot by Wyler and his cinematographers resides at the National Archives. In 2016, documentary filmmaker Eric Nelson became aware that 34 reels of raw footage were available in the National Archives. He led a team that replaced scratched and faded frames. After restoration, he used the footage to cut a new documentary entitled The Cold Blue. The crew members lived full lives after the war, though they carried memories that set them apart from others. Robert K. Morgan was hospitalized April 22, 2004, with a fractured vertebra in his neck after falling outside Asheville Regional Airport while returning home from an air show. He died at Mission Hospital on May 15, 2004, from complications due to his injuries, including pneumonia. James A. Varinas died on March 3, 2003. Cecil Scott retired from Ford Motor Company after 30 years, dying in 1979. The other crew members returned to ordinary civilian lives. They became fathers and grandfathers. They worked regular jobs. They lived in suburbs across America. But Memphis Belle's story was never just about one crew or one aircraft alone. A total of 350,000 airmen served with the 8th Air Force in England. 26,000 were killed in action, representing a casualty rate of 7.42%. Compared to other military branches, the statistics were sobering. U.S. Marines sustained 3.29% casualties. U.S. Army casualties reached 2.25%. U.S. Navy losses were 0.41%. The Air Corps sustained the heaviest losses of any service branch. More airmen with the 8th Air Force lost their lives than the entire Marine Corps, whose enrollment included 250,000 more personnel. Strictly measuring mortality rates for the 210,000 aircrew members, casualty figures soared to 12.38%. 21,000 ended up in prisoner-of-war camps. The 250,000 aircrew members who flew bomber missions with 8th Air Force sustained 58,000 total casualties. This included 18,000 killed in action, 6,500 wounded, and 3,500 listed as missing. During the heaviest combat against Germany, U.S. bomber crewmen had a 1 in 4 chance of survival. Consider that statistic carefully. 1 in 4. If you were a bomber crewman in early 1943, you had the same odds of surviving as a coin coming up heads twice consecutively. Memphis Belle crew defied these odds not once or twice, but more than 24 times. On some missions, losses were absolutely catastrophic. The Regensburg mission in August 1943 saw 30% losses. The Schweinfurt mission in October witnessed 28% casualties. After Schweinfurt, B-17s did not again fly deep into Germany until long-range P-51 fighters became available for escort duty. The doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing had proven too costly to sustain. The North American P-51 Mustang became truly effective when it became the P-51B model. Its original American Allison engine was replaced by the Packard supercharged version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in late 1942. The first P-51B fighters entered service in England during December 1943. Had P-51s been available earlier, thousands of airmen's lives might have been saved. The long-range escort capability they provided changed the entire strategic bombing campaign. For the bombing offensive as a whole, 8th Air Force lost 4,182 aircraft from a total of 273,841 sorties flown, representing a loss rate of 1.5%. Yet even at 1.5%, when crews had to fly multiple missions, The mathematics remained brutal. By 1945, 8th Air Force was operating at much lower loss rates and putting 60% of bombs within 1,000 feet of aiming points. This represented almost 4 times better accuracy than achieved in the dark days of 1943. The campaign evolved, improved, and ultimately succeeded in its objectives. Success came at a terrible price in human lives. Morgan remembered no easy missions, no milk runs as they were sometimes called. Every mission involved flying through flak so thick it appeared you could walk on it. Every mission brought German fighters attacking in coordinated waves. Every mission meant watching other bombers go down, seeing parachutes blossom against the sky, counting the chutes, and knowing that not everyone made it out alive. At 25,000 feet altitude, temperatures plummeted to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Frostbite was common among crew members. The thin air required oxygen masks that frequently malfunctioned. The aircraft lacked pressurization systems. Gunners stood at open waist windows, exposed to screaming wind at high altitude. The noise level was absolutely deafening. Stress remained constant throughout every mission. Through all of this, Memphis Belle crew persevered mission after mission. Morgan believed the secret to successful B-17 missions was maintaining tight formations, so tight that wingtips nearly touched during flight. This required absolute concentration and complete trust among pilots. A moment's inattention could cause catastrophic mid-air collisions. The crew chief also deserves recognition for Memphis Belle's survival. Joe Giambrone from Hulneville, Pennsylvania, oversaw replacement of 9 engines, both wings, 2 tail sections, both main landing gear assemblies, and countless other components to keep the Belle in top operational condition. While flight crews received medals and publicity, ground crews like Giambrone made continued operations possible. They worked through brutal English winters, often in open conditions, performing miracles of maintenance and repair work. Without their dedication and skill, no bomber would have remained airworthy for 25 missions. Memphis Belle's survival was partly luck, but it was also due to Morgan's exceptional skill as a pilot and his crew's professional competence. They worked together seamlessly under extreme stress conditions. Each man knew his job thoroughly and executed it well when lives depended on performance. This teamwork, this mutual trust and professional competence made the difference between survival and death. After completing their tour, several crew members wanted to continue fighting the war. Casimir Nastal returned to the European theater after the publicity tour ended. He completed a total of 60 combat missions before war's end. John Quinlan tried unsuccessfully to fly again with Robert Morgan in the Pacific Theater, but was eventually assigned to the China-Burma-India Theater. There he shot down 3 Japanese Zero fighters to become a gunner ace before his B-29 was shot down. These men, having survived the impossible once, chose to face those odds again voluntarily. Morgan himself flew a second combat tour in the Pacific Theater. He commanded a B-29 Superfortress named Dauntless Dottie that led the first B-29 raid on Tokyo on November 24, 1944. The war continued for him in a different aircraft over different targets, but with the same deadly risks. The story of Memphis Belle is ultimately about ordinary Americans accomplishing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. None of these men were born heroes. They came from farms and factories, schools and shops. They volunteered or were drafted, completed training, and found themselves in the deadliest air war in human history. They rose to meet that challenge. They did not think of themselves as heroes at all. In post-war interviews, they consistently deflected praise and talked about simply doing their jobs. They emphasized contributions of others rather than their own achievements. This humility, this reluctance to claim special status, characterized their entire generation. They had done what needed doing, and that was sufficient for them. But we can recognize what they accomplished, even if they could not. They flew into death's face 24 times and returned home. They helped prove that daylight precision bombing could work effectively, even though initial doctrine required major modifications. They inspired a nation that desperately needed inspiration during the dark days of early 1943. They became symbols of American determination, courage, and resilience. Today, Memphis Belle sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, restored to absolute perfection. The aircraft embodies as much symbolism for the Air Force in its fight over war-torn European skies as the flag raising on Iwo Jima represents for the Marine Corps, or USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor symbolizes for the Navy. The bomber sits with bomb bay doors open wide. Propellers are attached and gleaming. Nose art shines brilliantly under museum lighting. Mission markers and fighter kill symbols are painted precisely on the fuselage. Every rivet, every panel, every instrument has been carefully restored to wartime configuration. She looks exactly as she did on that May Day in 1943, when she returned from Lorient for the final time. But this is not the Hollywood version of events. This is not a sanitized, simplified story of heroic Americans easily defeating evil Germans. This is the true story of young men, barely out of their teens, who climbed into aluminum aircraft every few days and flew directly into the most concentrated air defenses in military history. These were men who knew statistically they probably would not survive their combat tours. Men who did it anyway, because the job needed doing. The real story of Memphis Belle is not just about one crew beating impossible odds. It represents what that achievement meant to everyone else still fighting the war. In late 1942 and early 1943, when bomber losses were catastrophic and survival seemed mathematically impossible, Memphis Belle crew kept flying and kept surviving against all odds. They became living proof that it could be done successfully. They became hope for all other crews still flying missions, still facing those terrible statistical odds every time they climbed into their aircraft. When they completed their combat tour and returned to the United States for the War Bond Tour, they carried that hope with them across the country. At every bond rally, at every defense factory, at every training base they visited, they were living proof that survival was actually possible. They were evidence that American air power could reach deep into Nazi Germany's heart and return home safely. They were, in the most literal sense, flying propaganda. But this propaganda was based on absolute truth rather than manufactured fiction. Memphis Belle stands today as a memorial to all who served in the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. This aircraft survived 25 combat missions when survival seemed statistically impossible. She carried 10 men through the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition in military history and brought them all home alive. The young men who flew this bomber did not think of themselves as heroes, but they absolutely were. Memphis Belle, beautifully restored and properly honored, ensures their story will never be forgotten by future generations. When visitors walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force and see this aluminum aircraft, meticulously restored to its 1943 configuration, they are looking at more than just an airplane. They are seeing a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and freedom's terrible cost. They should remember that this aircraft represents thousands of other bombers that did not survive the war. They should remember the tens of thousands of airmen who died in European skies. They should remember the courage required to climb into these aircraft day after day, knowing the odds against survival knowing that statistically they would not make it home, and doing it anyway because duty demanded it. Memphis Belle's legacy extends far beyond World War II itself. It influenced how America thinks about air power, strategic bombing, and the men who fly into harm's way for their country. It became part of the American story, an important chapter in the narrative of the greatest generation. It inspired books, films, documentaries, and countless articles over the decades. It captured American imagination in 1943 and continues doing so today. The aircraft itself is one of only a handful of B-17Fs still in existence anywhere in the world. Most were scrapped immediately after the war ended. Those that survived often ended up as gate guards or were modified beyond recognition for civilian use. Memphis Belle, through a combination of fame, luck, and dedicated people's efforts over many decades, survived largely intact. Its meticulous restoration allows current and future generations to see what these aircraft actually looked like in combat. They can understand the size and complexity involved. They can appreciate the technology and engineering that went into producing them during wartime conditions. The 10 crew members who flew Memphis Belle to completion of their combat tour were among the lucky ones in this war. They survived when most did not. They came home to families and futures. They had lives and careers and children. But they never forgot their time over occupied Europe. They never forgot friends who did not make it back home. They never forgot what it felt like to fly through flak and fighters. They never forgot the fear, the adrenaline, and the bone-deep exhaustion that marked every mission. In the end, the real story of Memphis Belle is about all the crews, all the aircraft, all the missions that made up the strategic bombing campaign. It is about the campaign that helped win World War II decisively. It is about the cost of that victory, measured not just in aircraft lost or bombs dropped accurately, but in lives forever changed by combat experience. It is about young men aged beyond their years by what they witnessed and endured. It is about families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers in the skies over Europe. Memphis Belle stands as witness to all of this history, and every visitor who walks past this beautifully restored aircraft should pause and reflect deeply on what it truly represents. The courage required to face impossible odds. The sacrifice demanded of an entire generation. The indomitable spirit of the men who flew into flak-filled skies over World War II. For Europe and, against all mathematical probability, managed to come home alive to tell their stories.